Dawn breaks cold over the Barents Sea. A thin layer of mist rises from the water as Soviet air defense radars begin their first sweep of the morning. Inside a reinforced concrete bunker, operators adjust their headsets, watching the green radar screens pulse like slow heartbeats in the dim light. At 7:12, something appears. A faint echo. High. Fast. Too fast. The tracking officer leans in. The blip is climbing through 75,000 feet, crossing the Soviet early warning grid at a speed the system struggles to calculate. It outruns the computer's prediction model before the plot can stabilize on the screen. Alarms sound. Orders are issued. Within seconds, long-range surface-to-air missiles ignite, shattering the quiet Arctic air. White plumes spiral upward toward the edge of the atmosphere. Operators brace, expecting a confirmed hit, but the target does something no aircraft should do. It accelerates. The radar echo stretches, then disappears beyond the tracking boundary untouched, unshaken, unreachable. The officers know the name only from intelligence reports. The SR-71, a machine that lived where physics began to bend on, where missiles went to die. This was no accident of design. It was the entire point. The story of the SR-71 begins long before its titanium skin ever touched a runway. It begins in the uneasy silence of the early Cold War, when two superpowers armed with new ideologies, new weapons, and new fears stared at each other across continents. By the mid-1950s, the United States faced a dangerous form of blindness. The Soviet Union was expanding its nuclear arsenal, testing new long-range bombers, and developing intercontinental ballistic missiles. Yet almost all of this was hidden behind a wall of secrecy stretching from the Baltic to the Pacific. For American intelligence agencies, not knowing was the greatest threat of all. The US Air Force and CIA urgently needed a way to see deep inside Soviet territory. Conventional reconnaissance aircraft were too slow and too vulnerable. Early spy satellites were primitive, offering limited coverage and long delays between collection and retrieval, and so the United States turned to high altitude for belief that flying above enemy defenses could provide strategic insight without triggering war. This idea led to one of the most iconic spy planes of the era, the U-2, flying above 70,000 feet. The slender-winged aircraft gathered imagery from regions no Western pilot had ever seen. For a short time, the strategy worked. The Soviet radar network struggled to track the U-2's altitude, and interception attempts failed repeatedly. But technology does not remain static in a Cold War. By 1957, Soviet engineers were deploying new tracking radars and SAM systems capable of reaching extreme altitudes. The United States hoped the U-2 still had years of life left until May 1, 1960, when U-2 pilot Francis Gary Powers was shot down by an SA-2 missile over Sved. The message was unmistakable. Altitude alone was no longer protection. The intelligence gap reopened overnight. U.S. leadership could not rely on diplomacy or guesswork to determine the pace of Soviet missile development. The Pentagon needed timely, accurate reconnaissance. The CIA needed a platform that could operate not only out of reach, but outside the engagement envelope of any weapon the Soviets possessed or were likely to develop in the near future. This challenge fell to a small group of engineers in Burbank, California, known only as the Skunk Works. Under the leadership of Clarence Kelly Johnson, they had already designed the U-2. Now they were tasked with solving a problem that conventional aviation wisdom said was impossible: to build an aircraft that could fly faster than any fighter, higher than any missile's effective window, and long enough to cross continents before radar operators could coordinate a response. Speed was no longer an advantage. It was the entire survival strategy. The earliest answers came in the form of the A-12, a CIA reconnaissance platform that would evolve into the SR-71. It required new materials, new fuels, new navigation systems, and new aerodynamic concepts. The aircraft would need to cruise at Mach 3.2, not in short bursts but for hours. It would need to operate at altitudes where the sky turned dark and the curvature of the Earth became visible. And it would have to endure continuous heating fierce enough to weaken conventional metals. But the geopolitical environment was forcing the issue. The Soviet Union was building dense, overlapping layers of air defense across its territory: long-range radars, interceptor bases, PVO command centers, and new surface-to-air missile rings. The United States needed an aircraft that could pass through this network without provoking global crisis and without risking the lives of its crews. In Washington, the calculation was simple. If the nation could not see inside the USSR, it could not predict nuclear readiness. If it could not predict readiness, it could not prevent surprise. If it could not prevent surprise, deterrence itself began to fail. Thus, the SR-71 was not born as a weapon, it was born as a shield. It emerged from the intersection of fear and necessity, an innovation designed not to fight the Cold War in the sky, but to prevent it from escalating on the ground. The Blackbird was engineered for one mission above all others, to collect the truth in a world where truth was increasingly hidden behind radar screens and concrete bunkers. The world was changing fast. Missiles were improving, radars were reaching farther, air defense networks were tightening. And the aircraft meant to outrun all of it was still only a blueprint on Kelly Johnson's drafting table. As the SR-71 moved from concept to engineering reality, the threat it needed to outrun was evolving at equal speed. The Soviet Union's PVO Stranitha air defense forces had become one of the largest and most technologically ambitious military branches in the world. Its task was straightforward: ensure that no American aircraft, bomber or spy plane could penetrate Soviet airspace without being intercepted or destroyed. By the early 1960s, this system had expanded into a vast grid of early warning radars, command posts, high-altitude interceptors, and missile batteries spread across thousands of miles. New radar models such as the P-14 Tall King and the D-Enster system could track targets at extreme ranges. Fighter aircraft such as the Su-9 and MiG-21 were being upgraded to reach higher altitudes, climbing toward the edge of the stratosphere. But the most significant challenge came from long-range surface-to-air missiles. The SA-2 guideline responsible for downing the U-2 was only the beginning. Soviet engineers were already developing newer, faster, higher-reaching systems such as the SA-5 Gammon, a missile capable of engaging targets beyond 150 miles. These platforms were designed specifically with one goal: to eliminate American reconnaissance aircraft before they could gather critical intelligence. For the United States, this posed a fundamental strategic dilemma. If the Soviet Union could shoot down American spy planes at any altitude, Washington would lose its only flexible method for verifying missile deployments, bomber movements, naval operations, and nuclear site construction. Satellite technology, though advancing rapidly, could not yet provide the daily, responsive, and wide-area coverage required for real-time intelligence. Thus, the Skunk Works team understood the stakes clearly. To survive, the SR-71 could not simply exceed the U-2. It had to operate in a regime where missile physics itself began to fail. This approach required a radical shift in thinking. First, altitude. Flying above 80,000 feet, the SR-71 would live in an environment where the air was so thin that most missiles designed for denser atmosphere lost maneuverability and energy. The higher the aircraft climbed, the harder the missile had to work, and the faster it bled speed during ascent. Second, speed, not bursts, not sprinting, but continuous Mach 3 cruiser sustained velocity that transformed the geometry of interception. A missile fired from the ground faced several immutable problems: reaction time, climb, angle, and closing distance. Even if a missile achieved Mach 4 or Mach 5, it could not maintain those speeds during steep climbs into thin air. Meanwhile, the SR-71, moving in a nearly straight energy-efficient line, could simply outrun the predicted intercept point. Third, heat. At Mach 3.2, the aircraft's surface temperature exceeded 600 degrees Fahrenheit, 315 degrees Celsius. Conventional aluminum would melt or deform. The solution was to build the Blackbird almost entirely from titanium, a metal so difficult to work with that the United States had to quietly source much of it ironically from the Soviet Union through third-party intermediaries. Fourth, fuel and materials. The aircraft leaked on the ground because its titanium skin panels only sealed at high temperature, expanding during flight. The fuel itself, JP-7, was engineered not to ignite under extreme heat and pressure. It doubled as a coolant for the aircraft systems, absorbing heat from radar equipment, hydraulic lines, and even the cockpit before being burned by the engines. Finally, engine technology. The J-58 power plants were unlike any engines in the world. At high Mach numbers, more than 80% of the SR-71's thrust came not from the compressor itself but from the air bypassing the turbojet and feeding the afterburner directly, transforming the engine into a ramjet system. This was not a quirk. It was survival engineering. All these elements created an aircraft that lived in a narrow aerodynamic and thermal envelope, a space where almost no missile could reliably operate. Even if a Soviet SAM detected the Blackbird, engaged it, and launched at the perfect moment. The SR-71's combination of altitude, speed, and energy meant the missile would be forced into a near-vertical climb, draining performance. Small miscalculations, fractions of a second translated into miles of spatial error. In other words, the SR-71 did not defeat missiles, it outran their mathematics throughout the 1960s and 70s. As the Cold War grew more volatile, this aircraft became central to U.S. intelligence strategy. It could survey hostile territory in minutes, delivering photographic resolution unmatched until the arrival of next-generation satellites. It did so without violating the nuclear threshold, without firing a weapon, and without suffering a single combat loss to enemy action. But for all its engineering brilliance, the SR-71 story cannot be understood through physics alone. The aircraft was operated by people pilots, reconnaissance officers, ground crews who lived at the edge of human endurance just as the jet lived at the edge of atmospheric tolerance. Their story reveals the other half of the Blackbird's legend. The SR-71 was not merely an aircraft, it was a controlled violation of the known limits of aerodynamics. Every component, the shape, the engines, the materials was designed for an environment where almost no aircraft had ever operated for more than a few minutes. The Blackbird's signature feature, the sharply swept chines along the fuselage, created both lift and stability at extreme speeds. These chines produced vortices that clung to the aircraft's surface, increasing control, authority when normal wings would lose effectiveness in the thin upper atmosphere. Its engines, the Pratt & Whitney J58, were equally unconventional. At high Mach numbers, traditional turbojets choke on incoming air, unable to compress the volume fast enough to sustain thrust. The J58 solved this problem through an ingenious system of variable geometry. Inlet spikes at the nose of each engine automatically translated forward and backward by several inches to maintain the critical shockwave position at the intake lip. This stabilized airflow during Mach 3 cruise, preventing compressor stalls that would be catastrophic at such speeds. But the true innovation was the bypass system. Once the SR-71 reached its design speed, as much as 80% of incoming air bypassed the compressor entirely, feeding directly into the afterburner. In effect, the aircraft transitioned into ramjet-like behavior without ever switching engines. This hybrid configuration enabled a sustained cruise velocity that no operational aircraft has matched since. The aerodynamic and thermal challenges pushed the Skunk Works far beyond conventional materials. Alumina was entirely unsuitable, steel was too heavy. Only titanium possessed the strength-to-weight ratio and heat tolerance necessary for the mission. But titanium is notoriously difficult to machine, weld, and shape. Tools broke frequently, panels warped under heat treatments. Even sourcing the raw material required covert procurement from the very country the aircraft was meant to spy on. Yet each obstacle reinforced the same conclusion. The SR-71 had to live in a domain where enemy missiles would struggle to function. All these engineering decisions merged into one black, heat-blurred silhouette formed a machine, uniquely adapted to survive the Cold War's most hostile airspace. If flying a typical fighter jet is akin to operating inside a machine, flying the SR-71 was closer to riding inside a meteor that had agreed not to burn up. At Mach 3.2, the aircraft did not simply move through the atmosphere, it slammed into it, compressing air into an intense thermal boundary layer that heated its skin to temperatures exceeding 600 degrees Fahrenheit, 315 grados. This heat was not a byproduct. It was a design variable. The thermal contraction and expansion of the titanium airframe meant the aircraft literally changed shape between the runway and the stratosphere. On the ground, panels sat loosely, leaving visible gaps that caused the Blackbird to leak fuel. Only after takeoff, when the aircraft reached high Mach and the skin expanded, did the panels seal as intended. This phenomenon bewildered observers but was central to its design philosophy. The SR-71 was engineered for performance at speed, not convenience on the ground. Inside the aircraft, the cockpit was a tightly controlled microclimate. Without advanced insulation and cooling, temperatures would have risen to levels unsafe for human survival. The JP-7 fuel itself acted as a heatsink, circulating through sensitive components before reaching the engines. This dual-purpose system allowed the aircraft to dissipate the extraordinary heat load generated by its speed. No missile system, fielded during the SR-71's operational life, could comfortably operate at such thermal extremes. The air at altitude was too thin for maneuvering, too cold for consistent chemical battery operation, and too unforgiving for sustained homing. Meanwhile, the Blackbird thrived in that environment. Its heat was not a flaw, it was armor. The SR-71's operators lived in a psychological and physiological space unlike any other aircrew in the world. Pilots and reconnaissance systems officers wore full pressure suits similar to those used by early astronauts. These suits were essential not only for protection in case of cabin depressurization, but also as a symbol of the conditions they were about to face. At cruising altitude, the ambient pressure was so low that unprotected blood would boil, vision could be lost, consciousness could evaporate in seconds. Training was rigorous. Crews endured centrifuge sessions to prepare for sustained acceleration, altitude chamber exercises to simulate decompression, and long-duration missions to test mental endurance. Unlike fighter pilots who maneuvered aggressively, SR-71 crews relied on precision, restraint, and an unbroken focus on the aircraft's fragile thermal and aerodynamic balance. Any abrupt control input risked destabilizing a machine that existed at the margin of feasible flight. Psychologically, the missions demanded calm under pressure. Pilots were acutely aware that they were unarmed, flying predictable routes through some of the most heavily defended airspace on Earth. Their only defense was speed, altitude, and faith in the engineering beneath them. Despite the stakes, crews consistently described the experience not as fear but as profound concentration state in which the aircraft became an extension of their will. In the end, the Senior 71's human dimension mirrored its mechanical one, disciplined, elegant, and unwavering at the edge of what was possible. To understand why the SR-71 mattered, one must understand the strategic psychology of the Cold War. The United States did not build the Blackbird to dominate air combat. It built it to dominate information, because information was the most valuable currency of the nuclear era. Diplomatic tensions, missile deployments, bomber movements, nuclear site construction could shift global stability within hours. The SR-71 was the United States, guaranteed that surprises would not determine policy, operating from key forward bases such as Kadena Air Base in Okinawa and RAF Mildenhall in the United Kingdom. The SR-71 could reach critical hotspots across Europe, the Middle East, and Asia with unmatched speed. It flew predetermined, internationally coordinated routes, often threading the boundaries of hostile airspace without technically violating it. These profiles were carefully chosen to force adversaries to react without crossing legal thresholds that might trigger escalation. The intelligence it collected shaped U.S. policy at the highest levels. During the Vietnam War, it monitored North Vietnamese supply routes and missile sites. In the Middle East, it documented shifting alliances and military buildup. Along the Soviet periphery, it provided data on ballistic missile fields, submarine deployments, and changes in radar networks. The Blackbird was not a weapon but a lens, one that offered clarity at moments when nations risked acting on fear. This intelligence consistency prevented Without it, leaders could mistake routine military movements for imminent nuclear preparations. The SR-71 acted as a stabilizer in a chaotic geopolitical environment, enabling policymakers to operate with grounded assessments rather than guesses. In this sense, its impact extended far beyond aviation. The aircraft served as a strategic shield for global balance. The SR-71's survival was not luck, nor was it merely the result of sophisticated engineering. It was the product of cold, unforgiving mathematics. A missile fired at the Blackbird faced a set of challenges that compounded from the moment it left the launch rail. First, reaction time. The SR-71's speed meant that Soviet operators had only seconds to calculate a firing solution. A delay of even 2 or 3 seconds meant the aircraft had already moved miles from its previous position. Radar systems struggled to maintain a stable track long enough to guide a missile with precision. Second, intercept geometry. To reach an aircraft flying at Mach 3 and above 80,000 feet, a missile had to climb steeply while maintaining high velocity. This ascent bled kinetic energy rapidly. Even missiles capable of Mach 5 speeds performed those feats only in dense air. In thin upper atmospheric conditions, maneuverability and speed dropped sharply. Third, guidance limits. Radar-guided missiles required continuous tracking data. If the target outran the radar's update capability or exceeded its angular velocity threshold, the missile lost precise lock. At the Blackbird's speed, even small fluctuations in radar quality produced enormous positional errors. Finally, lead collision dynamics. To hit a fast-moving target, a missile cannot aim at where the aircraft is, it must aim at where it will be. But with the SR-71 accelerating during an intercept, the prediction model was constantly shifting. A missile designed for typical aircraft speeds simply could not account for a target moving faster than the engagement envelope assumed. For these reasons, Soviet missile crews often saw the same outcome. Their missiles streaked upward, left curling contrails behind them, and eventually traced graceful arcs back down as their fuel depleted. The SR-71 was long gone. Perhaps the most overlooked angle of the SR-71 story is the moral lens. In an era when aircraft were built primarily for destruction, the Blackbird embodied a different idea, an aircraft designed to prevent conflict rather than win it through violence. It carried no weapons, fired no shots, and never engaged in combat. Yet adversaries feared it precisely because it illuminated what they wanted hidden. Its presence had a psychological effect on both sides of the Iron Curtain. To us allies, it symbolized technological superiority and strategic reassurance. To adversaries, it represented an almost mythical opponent, one that mocked their most advanced air defenses simply by existing. Soviet commanders often complained that the Blackbird could see everything and escape everything, a sentiment that reflected the frustration inherent in trying to stop a machine built around the very physics that constrained missile design. This psychological impact rippled outward. It influenced arms control negotiations, raised questions about airspace sovereignty, and forced both superpowers to consider the consequences of escalation in unprecedented ways. The SR-71 showed that deterrence could be achieved not through bombing raids or nuclear brinkmanship, but through information dominance. In this sense, the aircraft carried a moral weight. It was a machine that potentially prevented war by reducing uncertainty. At a time when misjudgment could ignite global catastrophe, clarity was as powerful as any missile. By the late 1960s, the SR-71 was no longer a theoretical threat on Soviet planning charts. It was a living presence appearing on radar networks from the Arctic Circle to Southeast Asia, crossing intelligence boundaries in minutes, and generating a level of frustration inside enemy command centers that no other aircraft produced. The Cold War had given birth to many legends, but none provoked such intense technological responses as the Blackbird's high-speed reconnaissance runs. Nowhere was this clearer than during the aircraft missions over and around North Vietnam. One of the densest and most lethal surface-to-air missile environments on Earth, the Hanoi region, supported by Soviet advisors, operated dozens of SA-2 guideline batteries. These systems had already proven their ability to destroy high-altitude aircraft. They had taken down Utah South. They had struck strategic bombers. They were feared by every pilot who flew combat missions in the theater. Except one aircraft flew above the envelope, yet was still targeted relentlessly. On a typical Blackbird mission out of Kadena Air Base, the crew began with a high-precision pre-flight process, donning their pressure suits an hour before even approaching the aircraft. Once sealed inside, the cockpit felt more like a spacecraft than an airplane. After takeoff, the SR-71 refueled from a KC-135Q tanker, then lit its afterburners and began its long, shallow climb into the stratosphere. The aircraft's altitude and speed were not achieved abruptly. They were built steadily, as the J-58 engines transitioned toward their ramjet-like mode. As the aircraft approached the borders of North Vietnam, electronic sensors detected the first signs of activity. Tracking radars turned toward the inbound target. SA-2 search radars began sweeping. Operators prepared firing solutions. For enemy missile crews, the SR-71's arrival was an opportunity. Intercepting the most advanced reconnaissance aircraft in the world carried immense political value. The incentives to try were enormous. The probability of success, however, was vanishingly small. During one well-documented mission, the Blackbird's sensitive warning systems recorded over a dozen missile launches. Plumes arced upward from the ground like rising white needles against the deep blue atmosphere. Sensors picked up the distinctive frequency signatures of SA-2 guidance radars. Telemetry indicated multiple missiles, climbing aggressively toward the aircraft's projected flight path. Yet the SR-71 crew did nothing dramatic. No evasive rolls, no brake turns, no sudden dives. They simply advanced the throttle fractionally. The aircraft responded in the only way it knew how, by accelerating. Within seconds, the Blackbird was outrunning the intercept zone. The SA-2 South, climbing steeply, lost energy rapidly. Their guidance systems struggled to maintain lock as the target's angular velocity exceeded design parameters. Their control fins, optimized for thicker air, became less effective. One by one, the missiles stalled and spiraled away, falling back toward the Earth in long, sputtering arcs. Crews later described these launches with calm precision, never dramatizing them, because the Senior 71's defensive logic was not emotional. It was mathematical. The aircraft's speed did not merely help it escape, speed was the defense. Farther north along the Soviet periphery, the SR-71 faced a different challenge: high-altitude interceptors. As early as the mid-1970s, the Soviet Union deployed the MiG-25 Foxbat, theoretically capable of reaching the SR-71's altitude range. In practice, the Foxbat could climb high but not long enough to complete a firing solution. Pilots could achieve a brief zoom climb toward the Blackbird, but only by sacrificing maneuverability and risking engine failure. The SR-71, by contrast, maintained steady flight at altitudes where the MiG-25 was fighting for stability. Soviet radar logs show multiple attempts to intercept Blackbirds flying near the Kola Peninsula and along routes approaching Murmansk. MiG-25s scrambled. Ground controllers attempted to vector fighters into the Senior 71's path, but every attempt faced the same immutable problem: the intercept geometry never closed. The Blackbird was always too high, too fast, or too far ahead. One Soviet air defense officer later commented, in a declassified interview, that the SR-71 was like trying to catch a shadow with a net. You could see it, you could track it, but you could not touch it. Even more remarkably, these missions did not require the SR-71 to enter Soviet airspace. Most flights were peripheral routes, legally outside Soviet borders, yet close enough to gather strategic intelligence through advanced sensors and side-looking radar systems. Despite not technically violating airspace, the aircraft triggered full defensive responses, a measure of how threatening its capabilities appeared to Soviet leadership. This constant cycle of detection, missile launches, failed intercepts, and growing adversary frustration became routine. It formed the operational rhythm of the Blackbird's Cold War life. By the late 1970s, there was no longer any doubt inside either superpower. The SR-71 was untouchable by existing missile technology, but the Cold War was shifting, and the very forces that had created the SR-71 would soon begin to threaten its existence not in the skies, but in political chambers and strategic planning rooms. By the early 1980s, the SR-71 had become more than a reconnaissance aircraft. It had become a geopolitical phenomena, symbol of American technological dominance, a source of constant irritation to Soviet air defense commanders, and a machine so reliable at bypassing missile engagement envelopes that it seemed almost mythological. Yet the world was changing, and the strategic framework that once justified its existence was shifting beneath it. Satellite reconnaissance was accelerating rapidly. KH-11 digital imaging satellites could transmit pictures in near real time, overcoming the long delays that earlier film return capsules imposed. Although satellites lacked the SR-71's flexibility and could not be redirected mid-mission, they offered a political advantage. They never crossed sovereign airspace. As arms control negotiations intensified under leaders like Jimmy Carter, Leonid Brezhnev, and later Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev, the idea of an aircraft intentionally skirting the borders of adversary nations, even without entering them, began to appear diplomatically risky. Yet the Blackbird remained invaluable, especially during crises. One of the clearest examples came during Middle Eastern conflicts. When tensions escalated between regional powers, the SR-71 could be airborne and over the region in hours, delivering photographic and radar intelligence that satellites could not capture due to orbital timing constraints. Mission planners relied on this flexibility repeatedly, particularly when tracking mobile missile units, troop concentrations, or shifting territorial control lines. But the period also revealed the increasing strain on the aircraft's operational infrastructure. Maintaining a fleet of titanium's IND Mach 3 aircraft required a level of specialized equipment and expertise unmatched anywhere else in aviation. Each sortie demanded multiple aerial refuelings, specialized JP-7 fuel production, and constant monitoring of engine health. The J-58 was a masterpiece of engineering, but it was also temperamental, expensive, and nearing the limits of its maintainability as the aircraft aged. Meanwhile, the Soviets continued refining their interception efforts. Newer variants of the SA-5 Gammon and the deployment of the massive MiG-31 Foxhound introduced fresh challenges. The MiG-31, unlike the Foxbat, could sustain high supersonic speeds longer and carried more advanced radar. Soviet air defense doctrine began incorporating tactics to trap the SR-71 between overlapping radar zones, attempting to create windows where missiles could be fired from converging angles. These technical refinements narrowed but never eliminated the gap between missile capability and the SR-71's survivability. Even at this stage, the Blackbird's tactics remained unchanged. Crews maintained straight, steady tracks. Maneuvering was minimal. Climb rates and acceleration curves remained predictable. The aircraft continued to fly within its carefully defined aerodynamic and thermal limits. What had changed was the strategic interpretation of these missions. Some in Washington saw the SR-71 as a provocative relic of an earlier era, one that risked inflaming tensions, at a moment when both blocs were beginning to reconsider confrontation as the default posture. In 1986, following years of budget pressure, internal debate, and competing intelligence priorities, the first official discussions of retirement emerged. The U.S. Air Force argued that satellites and upgraded U-2 aircraft could provide adequate coverage. Critics of retirement countered that satellites were inflexible, predictable, and limited in revisits, while the U-2, though upgraded, could never replace the SR-71's survivability or speed. Yet, the political currents were stronger than the operational arguments. Arms negotiations were gaining momentum. Satellite reconnaissance had become a stabilizing tool for treaty verification, and the financial burden of maintaining a small, aging fleet of Blackbirds seemed difficult to justify in budgets increasingly shaped by long-range ballistic missiles, emerging stealth programs, and new strategic priorities. By the late 1980s, the Cold War's psychological climate had changed dramatically. Gorbachev's policies of glasnost and perestroika softened rhetoric and opened unprecedented channels of communication. In this environment, the Senior 71's missions, once essential to clarifying Soviet intentions, seemed less urgent to policymakers who believed diplomatic openness was replacing covert observation. Still, the aircraft continued to perform flawlessly. Even in its final years of operation, the SR-71 maintained its perfect record. No aircraft lost to enemy action, despite hundreds of missile launches and dozens of high-speed intercept attempts. Its very existence remained a reminder that American aerospace engineering had reached an echelon few others could match. Then, in 1990, as the Cold War neared its conclusion, the axe fell. The SR-71 fleet was retired. Some airframes were sent to museums, others were placed in storage. The aircraft that had never been defeated in the sky was grounded by forces it could not evade: budgets, politics, and the belief that the world was no longer dangerous enough to require such an extreme solution. Yet the retirement was not the end of the story. Within 2 years, during conflicts and intelligence crises of the early 1990s, voices inside the Pentagon questioned the decision. Some argued the Senior 71's unique capabilities were still needed. Discussions of reactivation began, and for a brief period the Blackbird returned to limited service. This short-lived resurrection demonstrated what its original designers had always known. The aircraft was not a relic. It was a capability unmatched by any platform before or since. Its operational peak may have passed, but its technological and strategic legacy was only beginning. When the SR-71's retirement became official in 1990, the decision marked not merely the end of an aircraft program but the closing of an entire era of reconnaissance philosophy. The Cold War had been defined by rapid reactions, uncertain intentions, and a constant fear of surprise. The Blackbird was built to penetrate that uncertainty. Its retirement signaled that Washington believed the geopolitical world was entering a gentler phase, one better suited to satellites, diplomacy, and emerging surveillance technologies. Yet, inside the U.S. military and intelligence community, the reaction was sharply divided. Many analysts and operators quietly disagreed with the assumption that the global threat landscape had softened enough to retire a platform as unique as the SR-71. They argued that satellites, though technologically remarkable, were restricted by their orbital paths. A satellite might pass over a region only every few hours or even once per day depending on its trajectory. If an adversary moved mobile missile systems or conducted concealed activities between passes, that activity could be entirely missed. The SR-71 suffered no such limitations. If policymakers needed a real-time intelligence picture, the Blackbird could be airborne within hours, reach its target area quickly, and return with actionable data the same day. This responsiveness, which satellites could not match, was one of the Blackbird's enduring strategic strengths. Nonetheless, the aircraft's maintenance demands, logistical requirements, and operating costs had become central arguments for its retirement. With the end of the Cold War in sight, Congress and the Department of Defense sought budget reductions across multiple programs. The SR-71, with its need for specialized fuel, maintenance crews, and parts that were increasingly difficult to manufacture, became a prime target for cut. The decision reflected a shift from crisis-driven intelligence gathering to a world leadership assumed would be more stable and transparent, but history rarely moves in straight lines. By the early 1990s, new conflicts and regional instabilities began to challenge the assumptions behind the Blackbird's retirement. The Gulf War revealed gaps in real-time reconnaissance that satellites struggled to fill. The Balkans and other emerging hotspots demonstrated that fast-moving regional crises could develop in areas not regularly observed by orbiting platforms. Commanders and intelligence officers quietly noted that an aircraft capable of traversing 2,000 miles in under an hour would have been invaluable. As these concerns grew, the debate over the SR-71's retirement resurfaced inside defense circles. Advocates highlighted that no existing aircraft, stealthy or otherwise, could match the Blackbird's combination of speed, survivability, and global reach. These pressures led to a partial reactivation of the SR-71 in the mid-1990s. Several aircraft returned to service, supported by updated sensors and new mission planning tools. Their brief resurgence proved a point that had been whispered since 1990. The SR-71 had been retired prematurely. During this reactivation phase, the Blackbird once again demonstrated its unique capabilities. It conducted reconnaissance missions that other platforms were either too slow or too vulnerable to attempt. Despite being decades old, it remained unmatched in altitude and speed. No adversary possessed a missile capable of effectively engaging it, and no fighter aircraft could intercept it under operational conditions. Yet, the institutional momentum toward retirement was too strong. Emerging unmanned systems, improvements in satellite technology, and reorganized intelligence priorities gradually overshadowed the arguments for keeping the SR-71 in active service. By 1998, the aircraft was retired for the second and final time from the U.S. Air Force inventory. Even so, the Blackbird's operational legacy continued shaping intelligence doctrine. The reactivation episode had demonstrated that flexibility and speed were still essential in a world where threats did not always conform to predictable orbital windows. And although the SR-71 no longer patrolled the edges of hostile airspace, its absence left a capability gap that future programs, manned or unmanned, would attempt unsuccessfully to fill for decades. In truth, the world was not becoming simpler, it was becoming more complex, and the Blackbird's retirement raised a difficult question. What replaces an aircraft designed to outrun the world's fastest weapons? The final retirement of the SR-71 in 1998 did not mark the end of its influence. In many ways, it marked the beginning of a new conversation, one about the limits of technology, the value of speed, and the changing shape of intelligence operations. Once the Blackbird left the runway for the last time, analysts, engineers, and strategists began to reckon with what had truly been lost. First came the operational lessons. For decades, the SR-71 had provided rapid response reconnaissance that satellites could not match. Even with advancements in orbital imaging, real-time flexibility remained elusive. Satellites followed predictable tracks. They could be blinded by weather or obscured by adversary deception. They could not be retasked instantly to investigate a sudden development on the ground. The SR-71 could. Its ability to appear over a crisis zone, capture imagery, and exit before air defenses reacted was something no subsequent platform could replicate. Next came the technological legacy. The Blackbird's extreme operating environment forced engineers to invent solutions decades ahead of their time. Its titanium construction informed future metallurgy and manufacturing processes. Its aerodynamic insights influenced hypersonic research and experimental aircraft that explored the boundary between air-breathing propulsion and orbital flight. Even modern stealth aircraft indirectly benefited from the SR-71's focus on heat management, radar cross-section reduction, and high-speed stability. Far from becoming obsolete, many of the Blackbird's innovations became foundations for future aerospace development. Engineers studying hypersonic glide vehicles, scramjet-powered aircraft, and long-range strike systems continue to reference SR-71 data. The aircraft's behavior at extreme temperatures and Mach conditions remains relevant to programs attempting to reach speeds once considered unreachable. Another lasting impact was psychological. For adversaries, the SR-71 represented a persistent reminder of American capability. Even after retirement, its legend circulated within military academies and defense ministries around the world. Soviet and later Russian air defense officers studied its flight profiles long after they ceased to appear on radar scopes. The fact that no missile ever successfully intercepted it even after hundreds were launched became a testament not only to American engineering but to the limitations inherent in missile physics. For allies, the Blackbird symbolized reliability. Nations participating in intelligence-sharing agreements knew that when crises erupted, SR-71 imagery could provide clarity faster than any other system. Its absence created a void that newer platforms struggled to fill. Commanders accustomed to near-instant reconnaissance now had to rely on orbital timing schedules or slower aircraft, vulnerable to modern air defenses. The aircraft's cultural impact also grew after retirement. Declassified documents, pilot accounts, and once secret photographs reshaped public understanding of Cold War reconnaissance. The SR-71 shifted from a classified asset to a museum artifact, yet its mystique only deepened. People marveled at a technology from the 1960s that still outperformed most 21st-century designs. Engineers from the era reflected on a machine that operated so close to the edge of physics that even minor deviations could threaten its stability. Pilots who flew it described an experience as close to spaceflight as atmospheric flight. These revelations solidified the Blackbird's place not just in aviation history but in the broader narrative of Cold War strategy. It illustrated that deterrence was not solely a product of weapons but also of knowledge, accurate, timely, and unobscured by secrecy. The SR-71 embodied the idea that information could prevent escalation, reduce miscalculation, and stabilize a world teetering on the edge of nuclear conflict. Finally, the SR-71 raised a question that remains unresolved even today. Should the future of reconnaissance prioritize speed or stealth? Stealth aircraft offer survivability through invisibility. Hypersonic systems offer survivability through sheer velocity. The Blackbird proved that speed alone could defeat an entire generation of missile technology. Yet no successor has combined both attributes at scale. Its retirement left a blueprint, a reminder that operating beyond the envelope forces adversaries to rethink their doctrines. Whether future reconnaissance platforms will follow that path remains uncertain. But the SR-71 demonstrated that sometimes the best defense is not to hide, but to fly where no weapon can catch you. The legacy of the Blackbird endures not because it was fast, but because it made the world safer in ways few machines ever have. The SR-71 Blackbird remains one of the most extraordinary machines ever built, not only for what it achieved, but for why it was created. It emerged from an era defined by fear, secrecy, and the possibility of sudden catastrophe. Yet instead of becoming another weapon in an already crowded arsenal, it became something far more subtle and far more important, a tool for clarity. In the Cold War, uncertainty was dangerous. Misinterpreted troop movements, hidden missile tests, or misunderstood intentions could trigger escalation cycles with irreversible consequences. The Blackbird's purpose was to illuminate that darkness. Every mission it flew, every image it captured, reduced the risk of miscalculation. It helped confirm what nations were doing, not what they might be doing. In a conflict where suspicion itself was a weapon, the SR-71 provided the antidote. Its unmatched performance, faster than any missile, higher than any interceptor, beyond the reach of every air defense system of its time, was not about showing off engineering brilliance. It was about ensuring that reconnaissance could continue without risking the lives of its crews or the stability of the world. The aircraft did not carry bombs, guns, or missiles. It carried information, and in the nuclear age, information was power. But the SR-71's deeper lesson is philosophical. It revealed that technology, when applied with precision and purpose, can reduce the likelihood of war rather than intensify it. It demonstrated that deterrence does not always come from strength alone, but from understanding the other side's capabilities, movements, and intentions. Standing today in museums, the Blackbird looks almost alien, sharp edges, swept chines, titanium skin darkened by heat. It appears ready to leap into the sky, as if the Cold War's thin air still waits above it. Its legacy is not defined by what it destroyed, but by what it helped prevent. In a world still wrestling with mistrust and emerging weapon systems, the Senior 71's central truth endures. Sometimes the fastest way to peace is simply to see clearly and to fly beyond the reach of fear.